What's up, everybody? Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. Good morning.
Good morning. How was your weekend?
It was a lot of writing this weekend for various reasons. But it
Right.
was relaxing. I got so much sleep Saturday night. Like that's what excites me now about weekends is that I get to sleep
Sleeping?
more.
That's cool.
Yeah.
How about yourself, Aaron?
I went to a wedding in Vegas, so
Oh,
it was sort of a nightmare, but I guess kind of fun.
was it at like the little chapel of flowers or something, or?
It was at the Italian American Club. So my cousin's super Italian, so he wanted to go where Frank Sinatra's performed and all these places. It was a cool wedding. Vegas is not, unless I have to go to a conference or something. I'm not a Vegas guy.
Huh. Well,
yeah, I kind of feel the same way. I could have fun hanging out with people, but like I'm not really into gambling, even at a low level.
right. Well, there's more to Vegas than gambling. You can just make a fool of yourself on the strip.
That's true.
So that's awesome. Yeah, I've been to a couple weddings there before. It was an interesting place. But
So it is.
anyway. Well, cool. This week we want to talk about tips for communicating with stakeholders. I think we can all agree this is a theme that is a bit overlooked, I would say, with data teams, data engineers and data scientists and analysts, I think all kind of lumped together. I think kind of assume that they can get by on their smarts and not the communication skills, especially when it comes to communicating with stakeholders. So what do you guys think? What are some things that come to mind with respect to communication? And also maybe some anti-patterns too with communicating with stakeholders.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are a couple of ways that people can approach this wrong. So one is to treat stakeholders like they don't deserve to know anything about technology or about data science. Like, oh, you can't understand. I'm not going to try to explain it to you. And then the other approach that's on the opposite end of the spectrum is to drown them in technical information that they can't actually use. And so it seems like somewhere in between is the sweet spot to say, hey, here's kind of an idea of what featureization is. I'm not really going to try to explain it to you because it's hard, but roughly speaking, we have to convert stuff that's in the data to something actually useful for the data science model. That's the core idea. Of course, you can go a lot deeper than that, but it's like somehow you want the everyman's explanation will actually be useful to that stakeholder so they can understand what you're working on and how it's going to deliver value for the business.
What do you think, Aaron?
Well, so when I went from, I did a year and a half or so as a product manager, specifically in machine learning and data platforms. And the reason I took that gig is because no one else wanted to do it, and they offered me a raise. So, I got kids. I figured I'd try it. Now I'm back in data engineering. So you can see the path I chose. But there a lot of things come to mind when it comes to communicating with stakeholders. And I'll just say this. I like what you said about being smart. I tell people you don't get paid because you're smart, right? It's like saying that an NBA basketball player gets paid because they're in shape.
Or because they're tall. Yeah.
Right. Being in shape is just like a given, right? So you're a data scientist, a lot of you have PhDs. We know you're smart. You get paid for what value you bring. And if I was going to say the two biggest, we could break this down a little bit, but the biggest pattern is don't explain a bunch of Sigma notation in your PowerPoints and explain what you want to accomplish. Explain what value you're bringing the business with what you're proposing. And the other side of that is don't assume that because it's such an obscure topic that you can get away with not explaining stuff. There was a time, kind of a golden day, I think, in data science when I first came around the industry, where you could just get away with not really explaining yourself and doing models that didn't make it to production and things. And I think those times are over. I don't think that those times, maybe some small company that are still mesmerized by it, but you have to learn the communication skills, right? And I'd say always start with value. And the anti-pattern is when you don't explain the value that you're trying to bring. And I think if you stick to that, that's the first place to start, is talk about what value you're bringing to business.
What is value? I know we kind of talk about this in various conversations, but what does value mean to you guys?
Kind of depends on what the business is trying to accomplish. Are they trying to bring in more users? Are they trying to get more user engagement? Are they just directly concerned with like financial transactions, with purchases? And fundamentally, the goal of data science or machine learning is to help them with whatever that business metric happens to be typically.
Yeah, I would say that you're trying to optimize. I mean, machine learning is all about optimizing some sort of cost function. If you break it down, right? We could get fancy, but if we're ELI 5ing it, explain like I'm 5, right? You're optimizing a cost function, and you should probably stick to that cost function. Are you trying to get more users to click on something? Are you trying to increase more revenue? And those are the things that, if you think they're valuable, you should explain them, because the business will tell you if they're not valuable or not. And that might be why some people don't want to explain value, because maybe there's some fear that it might not be valuable, right? Or there might be a much easier way to do it, right? So I would say it's some sort of business outcome that either customers or stakeholders want, right? You're solving some problem for the business.
It's an interesting one too. We wrote about this in our newsletter, which, by the way, if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, subscribe to it at ternarydata.com. But the last week's newsletter, we talked about the ROI and adding value as a data engineer. And so a data engineering function is a bit interesting, right? Because you can either work on a product-facing team where the outcome, I would say, is very black and white, like your product's either adding value to a business, making money, or it's not. But if you're in a support role, that becomes a lot more of a gray area, because the value is not directly reflected in an outcome per se. If you're supporting internal data science or BI, for example, I would say then value is like how quickly can people get the correct data when they need it, for example, right? How often are you supporting data scientists and analysts in what they do internally? So I think it really depends on the role and the function to a large degree. But yeah, value should be, it's an interesting word, because we toss it around a ton. But when you sit and unpack it, it's like, it's an interesting idea. Matt and I, we bike shed this one quite a bit. So,
well, economists have been debating what value is for years. I mean, Marx and Ricardo and they had long debates on value. I did a lot of economics classes, so it could be somewhat subjective, but I would say you work for a stakeholder. They want something. Find out what it is, right?
Yeah, and I mean, there's a whole other debate about whether the stakeholders are focusing on the right value, but fundamentally, yeah, your job is to figure out what they place value on, and to work toward that.
When there's a right way to go about that. So, if you have a product manager or you have some sort of business leader that you're dealing with, as a data scientist or a data engineer, right? The right way to go about showing them that they're not focusing on the right value is by explaining to them these processes in a cohesive way and presenting to them what outcomes you feel are the right outcomes. It's not about just ignoring them because you don't think they're focusing on the right things, because ideally someone thought that they were competent enough to focus on the right things, and that's their job at the role, or their role at the company, right? So I would say this, what you just said, Matt, brings us back even more to make sure you're communicating what value you feel that you are bringing, because I'm saying feel because it can be subjective. But everyone wants to make more money at the end of the day. Everybody, data scientists that work at Amazon are not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it for a paycheck, right? So at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we are crossing our T's and dotting our I's to make sure that the things that are valued by the company are being done to justify our wages. Right?
That's interesting. I would say too, some tips for communicating is really, I would say explain what you mean to do up front. Too often, again, I think to kind of bring it back to what we were talking about earlier, data scientists and data engineers, it's easy to talk about technologies. Like I'm spinning up Spark. I'm going to use this library. I'm going to do flat map, and nobody cares really. Especially up the food chain. So I would also say make sure communication is two-way. Like make sure that stakeholders communicate what done and great looks like, as well as maybe what the opposite of those are. That's always hard to say, but you need to have the destination in mind, because communication is a two-way street. I will say, I've been in situations where a stakeholder, I think, obliterated trust with the data team by springing stuff onto them at the last second with vague requirements. And this pretty much almost caused a mutiny on an engineering team I was on. And it got to the point where I didn't trust that stakeholder anymore and wouldn't communicate with that person. I would say that's a very toxic place to be in. That person moved on, but that's an extreme of what happens, I would say, when stakeholders and their the teams helping that stakeholder aren't aligned at all, almost to a malicious degree. So that can happen too. So
yeah, it definitely happens. I mean, this brings up a good point, because we've been talking about how data scientists can get misaligned with stakeholders. And in the past, what you were saying earlier, Aaron, there has been sort of this ivory tower tendency in data science to say, hey, we're really smart and really cool, therefore you should pay us to be a team, because somehow magically we're going to bring value to your company. But that can also come from the other side, right? Like I've been on teams that were hired that were supposed to somehow magically fix a company's problems, but there were no objectives, there were no clear goals set, and not much happened. So how do you deal with that problem? Say the stakeholder needs to do more to define what your goals actually are. How do you, coming from the technical side, kind of say, hey, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? What do you want our team to put its effort toward?
Yeah, I can give an example that we've dealt with, right? So, and this picks on both sides, right? I've been on the business side and I've been on the data science side, and I prefer it on the data science, data engineering side, right? So that's one reason. I guess you're usually hard on yourself, right? So we were building some simulation platform, right? And let me back up a little bit. When I first got into data science and machine learning product management, I was looking for books on it, and this was like 3 or 4 years ago, so there wasn't many. And I came across DJ Patil, like the OG data scientist of data scientists, right? And he wrote like a 30-page book called Data Jiu-Jitsu. And he has this idea of overt and covert products, where an overt product is, as a data scientist or a data engineer, metadata or data points are your end product, right? So maybe you're building some sort of model. And here's a use case. You're building a model for marketing where you need to update some weights, right? And your end product is data, and then the business is going to take that and plug that into some sort of function in marketing. And then a covert product is like when you have a machine learning product or something that no one interfaces directly with the data. They interface with pictures or buttons or something. A self-driving car is a covert data product. A recommendations engine is a covert product. Like customers aren't looking at probability functions, they're looking at images, right? And so the first thing I would have to tell people when I worked in recommendations is I would say, customers don't click on matrices. They don't click on calculus, and they click on images, right? So what are these images, and how do we explain it that way? But then on the business side, I would get business people coming to me, and they would say, hey, why isn't the model up right now? And I had to, I would tell them that our loss function, right, was straying away from 0, and that we needed to look at our offline metrics to see what was going on and explain it that way. And that was the wrong way to explain it. That was not the best way to explain it. And I didn't know another way to explain it. Or when the business comes to me and they're like, hey, we want the sales price to be a feature in the model. And I say, well, we already have the min price in the model, right? So do you want the sell to be in the model or the sales price? Because if it's on sell, there could be an indicator variable on sell, not on sell. And you'd flip a flag, right? But if it's a sell price, but you already have the minimum price, then I try to explain to them, well, that's multi-collinearity. That's not the right way to go about it either, right? So I think that if you can speak in terms of end results that you want, I think that what the business needs to do, and I think I've said her name a lot. I don't know if I say it right, but Cassie Kozigrov at Google, talking about decision science and like kind of having this test-driven data science platform where really what the business should think about is the outcomes that they want. And they shouldn't be thinking about whether someone's using PCA or a multi-arm bandit or something like that. I kid you not, I've had product managers come up to me and say, I need you to build me a multi-arm bandit. And I'm like, for what, right? You know, what that's like violation of product management 101. So what are these outcomes that you want to achieve on the business side? How can we test it? And what can we set up to see that if we build this platform and this algorithm, that things are going to get accomplished? Then on the data science side, you want to speak to that too. You want to speak to, these are the outcomes that we achieved, right? You definitely don't want to throw a bunch of sigmas in your PowerPoints and linear algebra and different math operators and things like that, right? I remember taking for granted with executives, I was explaining NDCG and search algorithms, and that was a huge mistake. So, you know, I think if you can come to this common consensus of what the outcome is, how do we test that outcome, and we can talk about the acceptance criteria, we should be good. And I don't think that I have had to explain like why we were doing this reinforcement learning, right? And I didn't say, hey, we're doing this reinforcement learning because of this and this. I said, this is the outcome we want. We want to be able to simulate, right, a scenario. And when our model's doing this, we want to be able to test. And I didn't even say the word counterfactuals. I said what ifs, right? And I
imagine your user story being like, I need, as a user, I want to do reinforcement learning. So
right.
Right. Or as a user, I need to do multi-arm bandit in order to do X.
Right. But see, here's the trap. Because a data scientist will ask, well, how do I explain PCA to a stakeholder? Well, why are you explaining PCA to a stakeholder? Dimension reduction is not something a stakeholder is even they might think they care about it because they read an article on Medium over the weekend or something, but why do you have to explain dimension reduction, right? Like, explain the outcome and hold the business to that. Make the business tell you what outcomes that they want to get from you. Right. And that's what I find is the best approach to doing it. Because I've stuck my foot in my mouth so many times trying to explain a model or why two features are multi-collinear or why a feature won't work. And here's the other thing to my data scientist friends. If the business is coming up to you and telling you what feature they want in your model, that usually means your model is making money. So you're in a good point, right? You're in a good position. So
if they care enough to ask, then you're contributing somehow.
If they're not asking, what do these data scientists even do? We have all these PhDs in a back room that are doing math on whiteboards, but what do they even do? You know, that's a plus.
Somebody has a question here. Vasantha, she actually had an earlier thing. She doesn't know stakeholders business. Can you, I guess, tell them more about what is a stakeholder? I guess we should probably back up.
Yeah. So a stakeholder is someone that has, if you're building some sort of data science product, right? And I think in terms of product on this, if you're building some sort of model, right? Who is that model benefiting in the business? if let's take the example of an email model. Maybe you're building an email model that tells you like when the optimal time is to do email pushes, because most people are going to open their emails at this time in different parts of the country or the world, right? So you build a model that's going to optimize those times. The stakeholder would be the person that owns the business team, that owns email, that has the vested interest in the model that you're building. It might be a product manager, it might be a director, it might be a program manager. It matters how big or large the company you are. It might be the CEO, right? But they're the person that has the interest in what aim you're trying to achieve. So in this case, the stakeholder would be some sort of email director or product manager that's going to tell you, okay, yeah, this is the result that we want to get out of this model, right? And we want to see that these optimized times work. And did that explain it, Joe, or do you want to?
Well, I mean, I think Charlene has a good point here. Stakeholders want to know challenges, risks, and are they going to profit? I'll take it a step further too, and I'll say a stakeholder could be anyone that relies upon the output of your work. So if you're a data engineer, the data analysts and data scientists are actually stakeholders in what you do. They're consuming, right? They have direct benefit or risk depending on how well you do your job, right? And then they have stakeholders, i.e. the business and so forth. So it's the kind of stakeholders all the way down, as they say, right?
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, this is not always the case, but often stakeholders are the people paying the bills, right? Like they're the ones with budget. They're the ones who are going to see all those salaries and other expenses cloud costs coming out of their budgets. And they're going to want to know why you're spending that money fundamentally. Is it maybe someone else besides the email team is paying that bill, but they want to know how you're contributing to the email team if they're going to be spending budget money on your data science and data engineering team.
I think so. Yeah. He asked, is it correct to say that business stakeholders are consumers of your product? I think it's fair.
I think you got to be careful there, though. So
yeah,
if you're building like an automated robot that paints houses, I'm just making things up. The stakeholder might not be consuming that product. They might not be getting their house painted, but they need to make sure that the automated robot you build that paints houses is fitting the criteria that it needs to fit, right? Yep. Now, it comes back to me to that overt covert data product. When your end product is data, and Matt and I have talked about this, usually a stakeholder is the consumer of that product. And the hard thing about that is everyone's going to argue against your data, right? People are going to have different ideas of what your data points are. If your product's a self-driving car, it's usually the people that are driving the car that are the consumers of that product.
I think Ku, what's up, Ku? All the way from Singapore. Stoked he can join this late over there. What's up, man? He has a good point here. Before communicating with stakeholders, I feel we also need to understand the power dynamics and their career agendas as well. I think this is also an extremely underrated tip for communicating with stakeholders, is understanding where they fit in the power structure of the organization and what they want to get out of what you're helping them with, right?
Well, I agree. I mean, I say data science needs less Stephen Hawking and more Stephen Covey, but that's, if you're thinking about that stuff, if you're thinking, what is this person's agenda and everything, you're usually not the one I'm worried about communicating with the stakeholder, right?
True.
It's usually the people that are like, why do I even need to communicate?
Oh yeah, well, I was talking with a friend yesterday. I was climbing, and his wife with him, and his wife had just actually become a manager on overseeing a data team. And I guess one of the people on that team, he said, I want to be a lead. And she's like, that's great. Here's some requirements on being a leader for this team. And part of it was communication. And he said, well, I don't want to communicate with anybody.
Oh,
right. He's like, well, I guess you don't want the job then, do you? And I guess you probably don't want any type of lead job, because guess what your job consists of? It's not engineering, it's communication. That's 90% of your job. And if you're not doing that effectively, then you shouldn't get it. Because you got to communicate with your team, you got to communicate with stakeholders and so forth. Yeah, good point, Ku. I would also say, Ask DevOps says a challenge I've seen is when stakeholders also lack the context, tech knowledge on the challenges and how to interpret the data itself. He also says nice wallpaper in the back, so good choice. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this comment?
100%. That's why we need to make sure that we have established acceptance criteria. I mean, I've almost, I work at Ternary Data now, right? So I've almost driven Matt crazy where I'm like, hey, what's the acceptance criteria of this thing that we're doing?
I love it.
Because it protects
great.
you as an engineer. It protects you as an engineer, right? Like a good product manager is defining an end goal and acceptance criteria for an engineer. And a lot of good product managers understand technical concepts, but even as a product manager though, right? Like when I know math, I'm finishing a master's degree in data science now. I've taken grad school math classes and things. But when I'm talking to my scientists, I don't want them to break it down to me in math. I just want them to tell me whether the acceptance criteria that we built are checked off. At the same time, I need to make sure that I'm building the right acceptance criteria. And I think these old school agile processes, whatever you want to call them, I'm not married to the word agile, but these old school processes of acceptance criteria and kind of test-driven development are there for a reason, right? They should protect both sides if they're done well. I'm not saying that everyone's going to do it well, right? This is an ought, right, and not an is.
Yeah, it's interesting because often the data scientists may realize that they need to communicate back with the product owner, for example, and explain that there might be a better way to accomplish what they're actually trying to accomplish. Back to the discussion earlier, if people, and it does sometimes happen, that a product manager kind of obsesses over a particular approach and says, hey, this is my acceptance criteria that we're doing PCA. And it's like, well, let's not focus on PCA. Let's focus on conversions or whatever you're actually trying to accomplish with this product.
And a good product manager shouldn't even be asking that. I had to test. We had to A/B test. We were using logistic regression for a particular use case, and we wanted to move to XGBoost. I didn't ask my engineers, well, why aren't you using bagging or something like that, right? I didn't get into all those things. What I said was, why XGBoost, and how do I explain this, right? And it comes back to, right, if the offline metrics look better, the offline metrics look better, because we can say, hey, they're not technical enough, but we don't even know why our models win half the time. I mean, I know, sure, it's a black box with a lot of these machine learning models. So I don't think a good product manager should be recommending approaches at all.
Well, I remember
those approaches.
One client, it was interesting. We had one client who was the product owner was telling us how we should architect a system, like a data system. And and it was the weirdest Rube Goldberg idea I'd ever heard of, but he was really insistent upon this is how it needs to be built, right? And I mean, this person wasn't an expert in designing data architectures or systems. But because I think this person had watched a quick video or on a case study, they're like, well, this is how it should be done. This is how it's going to be built. And I'm just like, well, as an expert who does this all day, I wouldn't recommend this architecture. Like out of 1,000 choices, this would be probably the last one I would ever choose. So if this is how you want to do it, then I guess this is how you want to do it. But I don't think we're going to be doing it. So,
I had a product manager come to me after they learned about real time, and they had Kafka plugged into Hive, and they're like, I want Hive to feed Kafka. And I was like, well, you realize once the state is at rest, it's always going to be at rest, right? Yeah. You see all kinds of ridiculous things with product managers, and that could be a whole new episode, Joe. I mean,
it really could.
Well, maybe it is. I mean, how do we deal with Aaron? But Q has another point here, another kind of question. The more troublesome ones are those that throw keywords out that sound like they're technical and smart, especially if they're in a position of authority. Any tips to deal with them?
Yeah.
Man, this is kind of follow. So I'm gonna pair this up with Mark's comment here that all of this is predicated on having access to stakeholders. There are too many layers between stakeholders and developers. The entire project will suffer. So how do we reconcile these two? I mean, because Mark's spot on as well. If you're in a large bureaucracy, even if you have a product owner that spouts a lot of words to look smart or something, it's tricky to deal with that, because you not just have to answer their questions, but you also have to provide value. But if the person happens to be far removed, for example, this I think exponentially throws things off. So I don't know. How do you want to answer one or both of these questions?
I would say just don't speak to them in the same jargon, right? Like speak to them in simple jargon. The other thing I would say is this used to happen to us a lot at Overstock. And then when we got some big wins and we made it rain, the business trusted us more, and they, executives trusted us, and business stakeholders didn't get away with that as much. They weren't, so it's when you're kind of paying dues and you're new and you're trying to get something out there, you got to kind of deal with a little bit of the politics. And if someone's coming at you spouting like, machine learning, real-time, blockchain, every technical jargon they can think of.
I have a really good one you should try out. It's called the corporate BS generator. And so when you're dealing with stakeholders, I would say just go to just type in corporate BS generator and just start using these sorts of words like objectively customize inter-mandated paradigms. Like, I have no idea what that means, but it sounds smart. You could also distinctively engineer adaptive methodologies or uniquely productivate orthogonal content. Monotonically, that's not even a word.
That's the idea.
It is a word?
No, I think that's the idea, that some of these are just like
exactly.
compound composite.
And so I would just, if you want to flex, just use this site. It'll make you look both smart and nobody will know what the hell you're talking about, which might be the entire point. So you can authoritatively transform cross-unit scenarios. That is genius. That's the only way.
Oh, Joe is gone.
Okay.
Well, he'll be back in a second.
Don't flex though. I would say don't flex back. Like just break it down like you're explaining the easiest, simplest process possible, and get away from that game of multi-arm bandit machine learning aliens on blockchain. Right? Get away from that game.
And apparently that was so awesome that I lost my connection and my browser crashed. So it
was monotonically.
Chrome's protesting me, and it's like, stop, get some help, please stop. So I'm back.
Google blocked you.
Yeah, but in all seriousness, I mean that I've seen people, not to go out on a limb, but I've seen that type of corporate speak being used. In all seriousness, you could tell the person literally had no idea what the hell they were talking about, but they're just like, blah, 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 blah. But yeah, tips for dealing with a person who wants to sound smart and technical. In all seriousness, I'd say try and be accommodating, but there reaches a point where I think you just gotta, I don't know, my tendency is to be accommodating, but also say, like, if you have a point, like, please arrive at one soon. Because otherwise you're gonna be wasting my team's time and yours.
I think a lot of it too is just to ask the stakeholder good questions at this point, and that helps to cut through a lot of the BS. So going back to the real-time example, Aaron, we see this in requirements all the time. I mean, how often does this happen, Joe, where we get requirements like, oh, these reports have to be real-time? It's every time we have to go to the stakeholders and say, hey, what is real-time? And often it's like once an hour, but often it even comes down to, well, these reports, they're run manually. We get them every couple of weeks. We would like them once a day or once a week or something like that.
I think that's real time being described as once a month, and I'm not exaggerating.
So when you hear technical buzzwords, like ask more questions to find out what they're actually after.
Yeah, just focus on what the outcome is, right? Like if you're a data scientist or if you're a data engineer, you're designing data systems, right, or pipelines to help support that outcome. And if you're a data scientist, you're optimizing some sort of cost function that supports that outcome, right? And if we just talk about the outcome on all sides, it's just going to make life easier. I know executives don't always want to do that. I saw that question. And when you have an executive that wants to that's hard to deal with. I've had that many times, and I think meditation helps.
I'm going to have to take
running my breath. Because when someone, you don't want to be stupid, right? You don't want to just go in and challenge the CEO in front of everyone, right? So,
well, I think this is an art, and just in general with Warren Buffett said, I would say praise the generic publicly, criticize in person privately, or something like that. And I think that's a really good rule. Like you should never call somebody out in public. You do that at your detriment, I would say. There are times when it might be worth doing that, though, like when the person like genuinely deserves to be called out in public. But typically, especially, don't call out your CEO in public. That's just like not a good
No,
move
no,
when,
no.
like working there. But criticize generically if you have to, right? But this, and so some things I would say, other tips is like learn the arts of negotiation, learn the arts of communication. So a couple good books I will throw out. Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's, I think, over 100 years old at this point, and is still one of the best books on human relationships I've ever read. Never Split the Difference. I recommend this to everybody. I think it's the best book on negotiation. Because it goes against, everyone talks about like win-win scenarios. Never Split the Difference actually goes, it says that that's stupid. And I tend to agree with it in some cases. Because this is from the perspective of hostage negotiation. You're not going to negotiate like half of a hostage back, right? Like that's not really like a compromise per se. And so you can get what you want while letting the other person get what they want, but not in the traditional sense.
What was the example he gave? You end up with one red shoe, one blue shoe.
Right.
When
Yeah,
you
something
do
like
that.
that. Yeah, a brown shoe and a black shoe or something.
So when I'm negotiating, when I was working with, because I've worked in lead positions as well, with engineers, and I just or new product managers. If I was mentoring them, I would just say, "What hills are you going to die on?" You know, for when I worked in organic search, and we did the machine learning algorithm for organic search, the hill that I would die on is we don't boost. We're not going to let customers pay to boost. We can do that through our sponsored program, but we don't boost. And I had hills that I would die on, and I didn't negotiate on those.
Well, but as General Patton once said too, like, I don't die on my hill. I let the other guy die on his, and I help him along the way or something like that. So, or I make the other guy die on his hill. So, and that, but you get to a point like that in a company too. It's where I think it becomes combative, and that's a toxic situation, right? And so that's not, because at that point you're not really communicating with your stakeholders as much as you are, at an adversarial thing. But I do think it's good to set the lines in the sand, so to speak. Like the hill, will on it, because otherwise, it's like, well, yeah, we'll do bagging, right?
You don't necessarily need to communicate that, but I think that, like, if you're a technician, you need to know, like, kind of like you said, like, I would never recommend this architecture, and like, you probably didn't even want to build it because that's going to make you look bad if you build something that's going to break, right? I don't think you need to explicitly state that, but deep down inside, you're like, I'm not building this.
Well, I mean, at Ternary, one of the hills we will die on is we're not going to work with clients that aren't coachable or obstinate, and they basically just throw up barriers every step of the way. Like, we got enough business and enough popularity at this point, enough interest. Like, we don't need to deal with people like that, and we won't. That's the line that I set. Like, if you're intolerable to work with, there's other companies that will probably take your business, right? And so, because for me, that it impacts team happiness and team productivity. If we're being second guessed every step of the way, like, that's a line I can't cross, right? Or you're just making everyone's life miserable. Like, so for us, to me, that's a line that I set, but those expectations are also set. Like, you hired experts, let us do our job. So
this raises a question for me that I've been thinking about. That is, let's go back to the product discussion. What is a data scientist's role in suggesting opportunities to a product manager? So, for example, Aaron, suppose that you have a product, going back to the recommender discussion, the email discussion, suppose your product manager is very focused on recommenders, but then you say, well, maybe we can drive more traffic by focusing on how we send emails. Like, what's the data scientist's role in saying things like that and maybe steering the product manager in a certain direction?
I think the data scientist's role is exactly that. I listened to every one of my data scientists as a product manager. Now, there's some weird idea for product managers out there that they just sit in a vacuum and come up with like ideas, like from, the Platonic realm of Aidoses or something. I don't know, but like, ideas are cheap and tons of them come out. So, I had an executive, one of my best friends became VP of machine learning, and I was the product manager. And he became my best friend through working with him, one of my best friends. And he would do things like have people work on stuff and not tell me, and I'd have to be accountable for it. And I would say, don't do that, right? But like, tell me what ideas you want to have so I can defend them, right? But as a product manager, you're thinking, like, if your data scientist comes to you and says, hey, I've just thought of this, like, we should do this. What a product manager should know is if that's in the initiative of the company, right? Because if it's a good idea, but it's not in the initiative of a company, what you can do is say, well, that's a good idea. Can we try it like at this time? Can we incorporate it in this? And then the other thing you want to know as a product manager is like, well, if we incorporate this, will users like it, right? So how do we test it? To me, it always comes down to testing. I'm biased towards that. So like, you know, a data scientist should put their ideas out there. A data scientist didn't come to me though with a math equation and say, hey, you know, they said, we have blue buttons, we want red buttons, right? And that I think that a data scientist should do that. And if they don't feel empowered to be in a space to do that, that's not a company that's going to stay above water.
I think that, the PM should really be focused on telling the engineers what needs to be done, and then the engineers, technical staff figures out the how, right? But they should contribute back the how to the PM and the other stakeholders, saying, okay, so this is maybe how we're doing it. Does this match up with what you were expecting, and so forth? But yeah, it needs to be two-way communication. Otherwise, it's just a vacuum, and that's not fun for anybody. Mike actually has a question here. With communication, how often do you like to update stakeholders, or should they determine the frequency or the plan or problems? What do you guys think?
So I'm a fan of demos. I have a thing called the minimum viable metric, right? If you're building kind of an overt data product, and we've used this at Ternary, where what we demo to the stakeholder is a metric, and then we ask them if that's what they were thinking, right? If you're at a larger company, I think a Cadence is probably good. They might have some sort of agile system or something built in. And I think that demos should happen regularly. I don't think that there's an opportunity cost to trying to update the business all the time. And there's an opportunity cost to the business, like being all up in your business as an engineer all the time. So I think scheduling them and going through them is the best possible scenario for both.
I also think asynchronous updates are good too. Like if you have a ticketing system, just right, as long as your tickets are up to date, and that's agreed upon method that you're going to communicate at least kind of the detailed day-to-day progress on stuff. I'm more of a fan of that because it eliminates a lot of the synchronous communication. Which to your point is opportunity cost, right? That's time spent in meetings is time not spent actually getting shit done. So excuse my language. But I'm a fan of asynchronous stuff, but occasionally you do have to have discussions, right? And that's just kind of how it is. So what do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the asynchronous communication lays the groundwork for really productive meetings if it's done right. We've all wasted a lot of time in meetings. It's just a reality, unfortunately. But yeah, I think if you're really careful about that asynchronous communication, then you can be highly focused in your meetings. And like you were saying, Aaron, focus on things like demos to communicate what you're actually accomplishing with your work.
Now, Ela has an interesting sort of related question. Do you find it difficult to communicate with other engineers in a team that may be at a workplace who aren't data engineers? I think it's kind of how I'm reading it. Basically, engineers who aren't data engineers, and how do you communicate with them? I'd imagine if you're coming from more of a data background.
Yes, that's another. It's another plug for communication. Right. No one is more judgmental of a data engineer or a data scientist than another engineer that's been working in Java Spring Boot for 20 years. And actually,
engineers are just judgmental of other engineers in general.
Well, that's true.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm giving the extreme example, but like they're like, what do you guys even do? And
that's not real engineering.
No. Yeah. So yes. And again, I don't try to explain logistic regression well, I would argue a lot of engineers probably should have taken a statistics class, but I don't assume that they all have, especially coding camps and things like that. So I don't explain stuff to other engineers and math and data pipelines all the time either.
We spend a lot of our time, I'd say a lot of our time is spent educating software engineers on how to think about data. I think increasingly this is a trend you're going to see is software engineers are trying to do data stuff because data is, becoming more front and center and more necessary at companies. But finding data engineers is impossible these days, or it's very difficult. And so you're seeing software engineers, I think, taking the lead, which is awesome. But they don't have the background sometimes in how to think about data, right? Like, so I think a pattern you'd see is software engineers treat, you column stores. We always talk about this, or a data lake as like a transactional RDBMS system, right? There's blasting inserts and updates into these systems, treating it like a MySQL or Postgres, and then they're like, "Why is this database performing really slowly?" And it's like, well, it's not really built for that. But the nice thing is, I always say, software engineers, I equate it to like if you're going to get into MMA, right? Wrestling is probably one of the best backgrounds to have. You can kind of control where the fight goes, and I think that's awesome. And I think software engineering is similar, where if you got engineering chops and understand like system design and regular programming practices, like you can kind of dictate. You may not have the nuance of understanding data, but I think it's easier to teach you that versus somebody who doesn't have a technical background at all, like a data scientist trying to do data engineering. It can be done, obviously. Matt's a good example of a data scientist, mathematician turned awesome data engineer, world class. But I would say, you have a benefit as a software engineer coming out of the gate doing this, just because you are an engineer, hopefully.
And broadly, I would ask, I mean, maybe part of the problem here is on the data engineering side. In other words, maybe we're not doing enough to socialize knowledge about how data works in a non-transactional world.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. And so what can we do to like try to communicate out to software engineers who are very transactionally focused, work on services? Well, let's say data engineers in general, data scientists, like people who work with large amounts of data. What can we do to communicate that knowledge back? So even if they're working on those transactional systems, they have a better idea of what we actually do and why it's different from things that they handle day to day. And they could be better prepared to transition into a data engineering role, potentially, if they chose to.
Same with ML engineering, frankly. Yeah. I see a lot of I think as I keep saying, there's going to be overlap, and there's increasing overlap with software engineering, data engineering, ML engineering. There's obviously some key nuances with each of these disciplines, and rightfully so. But at the end of the day, it's systems design and systems engineering.
And what can we learn? What can we learn from software engineers and communication?
A ton. Great. Obviously, I would say all the stuff you're seeing that software engineers had figured out a while ago, Agile, for example, which is sort of an engineering that's more of just a discipline on its own. But DevOps, for example, right? Now you have data ops, now you have ML ops, all this basically ops. I was just speaking at a conference last week about a DevOps summit. We're talking about ops. And it's like, really, what's the difference between all these different ops? It's just that software engineering sort of got there first because they had to, because systems were blowing up, and like you can't have your applications blowing up all the time, right? Deploying to these systems, like continuous deployment, all these other practices are awesome. And I think every field is getting inspiration from software engineers right now.
100%. When I went to product, I came from software engineering, right? And like all the communication stuff that I just talked about, I got that from software engineers, right? Like they learned a long time ago, oh, these stakeholders are going to get in our business and they're not going to know and how. But sometimes engineers will gold plate stuff and they'll build stuff that's not necessary. And how do we deal with this?
But engineers engineer. That's part of the reason they do that. But I would say this is also part, to circle it back, tips with communicating with stakeholders. This isn't just like a data engineering discussion. It's not like data people are the only ones who have stakeholders, right? Everyone has stakeholders. Right. The tendency for engineers, if they're left unguided, they'll do what they do best, which is engineer stuff. That's literally
they're hobbyists, right, at heart.
Yeah, I mean it's the old fable of like the scorpion giving the frog a ride across the river or something, and then it gets stung at the end, even though it promised not to sting the frog. It's kind of like, well, that's what scorpions do, like, and it's it's an old Aesop fable or something. But same thing with engineers. It's like your job as an engineer is to engineer, and you're not going to sit idle not doing stuff. that's a tendency, right? So Maran has a kind of a question. During demos for stakeholders, I've learned it's important to show both the good and the bad. We called it the F up of the week. And if you couldn't share one, you weren't being honest. What are your thoughts on this?
That sounds like you work at a really psychologically safe company, and that's awesome.
Yeah,
It sounds like a great idea, but yeah, it's challenging in many companies.
If you're to that point as a data engineer, a data scientist, then you're in a good position, I think.
I think so. Yeah, I wish that would happen more. So, because you got to, I think leading with what doesn't work is a really good way of, I think, establishing rapport and credibility with people. So you notice this even in like people will, they call it the the S sandwich. Start with the bread. The middle is not too great, but then end on a high note, right? And so, I notice Warren Buffett does this in the shareholder letters. He'll always talk about somewhere he messed up. He always kicks off with that, because then it's like, well, I'm human. Let me tell you how great I am after that. I made, a lot of money, but you always, self-deprecation to some degree, I think is good. But yeah, to your point, Aaron, I think if you can have that kind of psychological safety, that's awesome. And that can't be understated. Most people just want to talk about the good, and it's not even that good sometimes, right? It's just like sugar-coated good. For the most part, it's all just bad.
And complacency is the enemy, right? Like if you want to improve, you have to be very self-critical, and you have to be willing to admit your limitations and try to improve those.
Yeah.
Just a plug for how awesome you guys are. I told you the first week when I messed something up, and they were great with it. So tangent, but I think that being at a company where you can have that kind of safety is important, because we don't learn unless we break stuff, is my kind of attitude, Well,
it's my attitude too, and I think, Matt's the same way. I would say where the dividing line is, if you break stuff and then hide it, that's where things go south. Like, or if you hide the truth, and even if it's bad news, if it's like material and it affects stakeholders, like, to me, and this has been on every team, if you hide information that's material to an outcome, even if it sucks, like you blew something up, I'd rather know about it. But if you're going to hide that, that's an instant fire. I don't give a shit. Like,
and why are they hiding it? Are they hiding it because they're scared of the repercussions? Because that's horrible. Or are they hiding it because they're intellectually macho?
Maybe a bit of both. And that's why we try and provide the psychological safety, I'd say, where if you make a mistake, that's cool. Own it, fix it, just get it fixed, right? But if you're insecure about making mistakes in general, there's probably plenty of companies where you can go hide out with other people like that. So, but Ternary's not that place. So,
yeah,
we're all honest to a fault, almost. What were you gonna say, Matt?
Yeah. Open communication, right, all the time. Like, it's really, really critical. And there are certain things like you just can't afford to mess up. Let's be frank. Like, things to do with security and privacy. Basically, you have to focus on those things before you try to get any work done. And I've seen a lot of complacency around those areas. I will say those are the areas where I will make an exception in terms of making mistakes. Right. Like, you just can't afford to make certain mistakes. Never. And that's where you have to make sure that you get the right help and set the right policies before you even start working, so that certain mistakes are just not acceptable. So.
Mark Keeling, he says the same principles in the military. You can mess up, but don't hide it. Bad news gets worse with time.
Definitely does.
1000% agree. So, yeah, and increasingly too, I would say, with the expectations that like extreme ownership and all these other management principles, I think are just, to me, that's like the management 101. Just give people the liberty to own their work. That also means owning your mistakes, right? You should create the safety, like Aaron was pointing out, where if you make mistakes, that's fine. Don't ever lose a shred of reputation for your company, though. That's the big difference. If you're lying, hiding stuff, and that doesn't help you communicate with stakeholders, and ultimately it probably cost you your job, depending where you're at. So, geez, on that cheery note, we got to wrap it up right now. So, but yeah, it's been a fun chat. I think this is a good conversation. I really appreciate the input from the audience. A lot of good ideas here. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube, please do. Ternary Data is where you can find it. Also, as I indicated on LinkedIn, we have a newsletter. We've had a newsletter for a bit now. but we have exclusive articles on there. You can only get them through the newsletter. Matt and I and Aaron will be writing articles as well. We also have links to awesome content that we find interesting throughout the week. So go to ternarydata.com and subscribe to the newsletter. We'll also be having some coupons for our services, as well as, just a good way to keep up to speed with what we're doing. Also, starting in a couple of weeks, actually, I think maybe even as soon as next Wednesday, we're going to be doing every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. We're going to be featuring like awesome technologies, awesome vendors, cool people we see in the industry. It's a bit different from the Data Nerd Herd, which is me just interviewing fun people that I find in the data industry. This is going to be like kind of the cutting edge products and technologies that we find fascinating. So stay tuned for more information on that. And until then, anything else you guys want to talk about or give a shout out to before we jump?
That's all I've got.
What you got? Right on. Cool. Well, thanks guys. It's been a lot of fun. We'll do it next week. So bye-bye.
Take care.